Okay, I want to cover a lot in this recording. I'm first going to sort of react or respond to dialogue between Bret Weinstein and uh, Weinstein and uh, Jordan Peterson, and most of it is, I guess, going to be uh, a dig at Bret. I think. I mean, I find it strange how what I would only describe as this short-sighted view of COVID-19, which Bret Weinstein is still sort of entrenched in, which I think is either I, I still find that these people on the left. I understand that Bret Weinstein is he's got a sophisticated view of these things, and he's an independent critical thinker. Uh, So it kind of it worries me that he can sort of be taken into a kind of intellectual reality tunnel like this. COVID-19 is not a serious disease. It the risk is insignificant to the population. We have done more damage to public health in our reaction to COVID-19 than the actual thing itself, and we have probably made this thing excessively worse by trying to respond to it and also by trying to uh, make vaccines for it. Uh, I think that on paper you could see that swine flu is probably a much worse, more severe um, influenza, and that swine flu only had better outcomes because it was allowed to spread quickly so we could develop herd immunity and get over it, but also that, well, you didn't have quite the same, I would say, harvest effect uh, that we had COVID-19 on the back of less deadly influenzas the year before, and you get this kind of excessive mortality, which is more a reflection of having weaker influenzas, uh, uh, but also it's just the kinds of measures that Bret Weinstein is promoting, or that he spoke about, the idea that when that you can try to sort of isolate, that if there is going to be a new strain, that we should lock these things down. This is a strategy of managing public health which needs to be placed in greater context. We must remember that epidemiology does not understand uh, um, everything, right? And there are different camps within the epidemiologists, and we've only heard from the one camp. But we have to let me slightly give the other side of this argument, which is that we used to live in a world in which there was very little contact between uh, uh, population groups, and you would have only naval seafaring voyages, and you would get what are they called, typhoid Mary or something like that. You get a carrier, and they would not even know that they were a carrier because they would just have the sniffles, but because they were exposing this new pathogen, this new virulent disease to a population that had no experience and no resilience built up to that particular pathogen, it would just decimate them. So someone with the sniffles would travel across the sea, and many people would die and many children would die, which is when you have old people dying at the same rate as young children, then you are dealing with a deadly influenza. COVID-19 is not a deadly influenza. It hardly kills children at all. It's only children with comorbidities, essentially, or with severe asthmatic lung issues and things like that. So you have to put these things in perspective. Okay, so this is not a deadly. Most of the people that die, if really, if you just look at some of the statistics, you'll see that this is taking out people who were, in some sense, on death's door already. And yes, there are sort of the outliers where you hear a story that someone died and you didn't, they seemed like a fit person, but actually they actually had a heart condition or something like that, or they had some kind of severe arrhythmia already, or I mean, anyway. uh, you know, and it's weird how sort of anecdote gets amplified and sort of, when there already is this almost perverse incentive to endorse a narrative that has already been created. And why was this narrative already created? I think it was essentially for political expediency in some sense. It was designed because it was designed to attack the Trump presidency, essentially. It was concocted by the American mainstream media, who latched onto this, and then they used it as a wedge, essentially, um, to try to dig at the administration. Um, and in some sense, the damage that it did to the economy. Well, and let me say as well that I think that that this is the kind of crisis that a society is prone to when essentially it's all about emotionally reacting to a narrative that is woven where you're not even allowed to hear the other side. You're not allowed to really hear the debate from two experts on either side of a controversial claim. Because, for the public good, you have to even censor and limit the, free flow of information and discussion. But let me just explain as well why the types of measures that Bret Weinstein is speaking about is preposterous. So you could be as successful as Australia. Australia has literally eradicated the virus in their population. That is how effective their lockdown was. That they stringently locked it down and they got complete control of the virus. Wonderful. First world healthcare system succeeded in eradicating the virus in their population. At the cost of what? At the cost of sealing their borders and never being able to be part of the international community ever again, I would probably say, because, or I guess the projected sort of political vision perhaps is that until they have eradicated it in the rest of the world, which is, I would say, impossible, or they've developed a vaccine to make it irrelevant, which is highly experimental. We have never made a vaccine for a COVID virus before. We've never tried to do it before, probably because it's probably a bad idea. I mean, these viruses mutate. You think that if you create a vaccine for them, that's not going to impel them to find a way and do what they already do, which is mutate around it. So, you might end up actually chasing this virus into something that becomes actually deadly. But let me just talk about something which is a nasty thing to talk about, but it happens to be a reality, which is that the actual positive public health function that is provided by these kinds of influences. Because when we have these large-scale viruses that sweep through our population, and then they essentially cull the old, they cull the immunocompromised, as if this isn't actually part of our general health as a species, as a group. And we have to realize that if people aren't being taken out by things like influenza, if we're going to completely eradicate all viruses, or if we're going to aim to eradicate all viruses, so what? So that our immune systems never have to do anything because the world has been, made safe or something like that. And then what will happen? So our immune systems will all get lazy. We won't have to contend with them, with maintaining them, and then maybe we'll all get taken out all at once with some kind of superbug. Or in the proximate picture that I'm trying to paint is that if you don't provide these non-deadly influences, non-deadly defined by the fact that they don't kill young children, but we don't let something sweep through the population to remove the immunocompromised, what do these immunocompromised people do? When they sit in the population and they're allowed to continue living for longer than they would have, but for the successful removal of these non-deadly viruses, is that you've got incubators there waiting to be infected by something. I mean, these are petri dishes. These are human petri dishes which are there to model human physiology, to model some model of and if you get something, if they get infected with something, now all the things that aren't non-deadly but are perhaps very virulent, when they reach these incubators, what are they going to do? You're giving room for other viruses. So I'm just trying to say that influenza, we have flu seasons, and we, a lot of people get the sniffles. A lot of people, get very hard flu, and they get taken out for a month even, or sometimes, if they get hit by a very bad flu, um, uh, you know, it's something that, in some sense, I do think that there are two ways of tackling this. Is that you could try to attack the virus with vaccines and things like that, or you could try to attack viruses like this, or you could promote vitality and health, and sort of regimes of how to maximize your immune system. There's sort of the two ways of tackling this from a public health perspective. Is you could try raise the general immune system and try to remove things that make people immunocompromised, or you could go for the actual virus itself. Obviously, when you go for the virus itself, it's very helpful for the pharmaceutical companies and things like that. But yeah, I mean, who knows? I guess we are now in science fiction. We've never made a vaccine for a COVID virus, so we don't know if the virus itself is not going to be able to essentially. I mean, we've now given it every opportunity to mutate, because usually what you would do is this would quickly move through a population and you get herd immunity. And we have, instead of that happening, we have given it maximum, by having lockdowns, we've given it the maximum amount of time to live in one host before it spreads to a new host that hasn't been exposed to it before. So if you look at the actual sort of the entire sort of duration, you know, we've given more incubation time over to this virus by not allowing it to spread, at least among the healthy section of the population, which would have been, I would say, much better for public health, which is a better strategy, because the kind of way that if you want to go the restrictive route, the way Bret Weinstein is talking about it, that means that you commit to eradicating the virus in the world. Otherwise, if you succeed in eradicating it in your municipal country, in your local area, then your local area cannot engage or correspond or transfer people and travel between your locale and some other place. And so, because we live in a world that includes the third world, that includes, sort of poorer countries, and other countries that don't have first world, medical health things, tracking and tracing. I mean, I guess, you could try to follow the Australian model and then sort of divide humanity up into two sections, I guess, or something like that, and then maybe have vaccine passports, and only people that have if the vaccines even hold, if that's even a capable, feasible process, which is, I mean, I'm doubtful of that. I also think that this new model of trying to constrain these kinds of viruses in this way will lead to weaker immune systems over time, because we're going to make it so that variants from different places in the world are not going to spread in the way that they naturally have, which is, I would argue, what we haven't had a real deadly virus in a very, very, very long time. And the reason why is probably because of air travel, probably because we have all now been exposed to each other's pathogens. So we've actually probably raised the general health of, we've tooled the immune system of everyone in the world, essentially, to a degree that it hasn't been tooled before, because we've had this broad exposure. And now, if we're going to go back to the old style and model, we probably are going to end up generating deadly viruses and deadly flus that we haven't seen in quite a while. The Spanish flu and things like that. And COVID is certainly nothing like the Spanish flu. I mean, this does not kill children. This is only killing people who essentially were already quite sick. So yeah, I mean, for Bret to sort of completely cotton on to the whole narrative that essentially is, these fear mongers, which as far as I can see, this is the same vogue, this is the same type of narrative as the systemic oppression of identity politics. It's the same narrative as the environmental CO2, like anthropogenic global warming. It's all that sort of it's this huge diversion where you can't talk about serious things, you can't talk about real things, like, well, we need more nuclear power, we need to stop pollution, we need to stop destroying the seas and certain biomes. Instead, we have to care about everyone tracking CO2, so, to centralize more power, in some kind of strong leadership, and where you have this false consciousness so that the top and the bottom can sort of make this kind of plutocratic, false revolutionary consciousness and cultural hegemon, which allows you to kind of subvert the middle and to sort of depress the middle and demoralize them and sort of give them their marching orders and create enough regulatory red tape that no one can ever, break this neo-feudalism and held in place by this new morality and this tech oligarchy that entrenches these new values of the identity. So everyone is sort of is managed by their identitarian. So it's like one ring to rule the dwarves. Five rings for the dwarves, 9 rings for the realms of men, 3 rings for the elves. It's sort of everyone has their own. Because we don't have the individual in the audience is not being addressed by the newscaster. You're not being informed as an individual. You are being placated and fed a kind of an emotional, reactive narrative that is addressed to your identity class or something like that. That you as an XYZ lived experience or something like that. Now, I just want to. Okay, so that's the COVID thing. I disagree with what Bret and Jordan Peterson are both talking about in terms of this being a developmental thing. You're talking about people who were not raised so much on technology that they avoided fantasy play. I mean, you can link this to developmental people that have developmental things missing, but I think it's a general cultural toxicity thing. It has nothing to do with the technology. You could say that it might be facilitated through, in some sense, social media. I mean, these young children that I don't think they became these identitarian monsters because they were playing on iPads instead of doing fantasy work. I mean, in some sense, at what age do they even start doing things like Facebook or doing things like looking at each other's avatars or having online personas? I don't think that they have. I think that obviously the cyberbullying stuff, which is usually in the early teenage years, is the only chance that starts to sort of really become pertinent and in the sort of cultural mix. And again, I would even say that is more of a reflection of the general cultural toxicity. That is not even a reflection of the technology itself. That is just because we have normalized a kind of borderline personality disordered sort of toxic feminism. Yeah, I mean, all of these sorts of things that you can describe as developmental. I mean, in some sense, the cultural hegemon and this general cultural template, which is being normalized, does require that people develop a narcissistic injury around their identity so that they can always just react to things. That is their main sort of bread and butter in some sense, because if they're reacting to a narrative, then they can kind of feel that they need safety for their reality tunnel, and that the best way to secure safety for that is in the same way that any vulnerable narcissist or covert narcissist does it, is that they complain about other people being in the driver's seat, and in some sense inducing them, or inducing yourself to be in a worse position, so that in some sense you never own your own self-determinism. You have already been subverted in your narrative of systemic oppression. And so, if you can constellate around a scapegoat, which is a sort of a nifty external locus of control, then you can always sort of externalize blame and accountability when things don't go your way. And in some sense, but it requires that anchor. You require some perpetrator to ground your whole view of reality on. And that formula, in some sense, generally, I think, is discovered by a few sort of cerebral narcissists. That's usually how it would present, I think, in sort of in boys and girls, which would also kind of have a kind of ideological narcissism, which is much more culturally successful at the moment in terms of the kind of the complaint against the patriarchy and things like that, and white supremacy. So you have all of these ideological things in the mix. To say that is a reflection of the technology, I think is crazy. This happened. I mean, probably historically. I do think that it comes from feminist departments and things like that, making these ideas palpable and somewhat viable, and available to young people, at least on a broad enough scale that they could get away with using them, and essentially it got such a foothold in the culture that then it reached a kind of tipping point where you couldn't beat them, or there wasn't enough. You couldn't create a successful subculture that could hold out, or something like that, or not a big enough one to retain most people, or something like that. And so, sort of on the preponderance of numbers alone, people not wanting to sacrifice their social life for principle, they just moved over, they just rolled over. And and then decided to quite quickly double down into something like socialism and things like that, because it's not nice when you are the problem, and you have to so it's much better to abstract out of being the problem. So if you are straight or heterosexual or white or something like that, then it's very good if you can generalize the kind of ideological accusation that's directed at you, and to say that no, you have a deeper commitment to a more esoteric, broader, sort of campaign of how to bring about the utopia, and you just kind of roll with it, and enlarge the accusation, and see yourself on the right side of some issue, and then you find your place within one of the ring sets or something like that, where it's all at core, it's all just a kind of idolatry of pure naked power, and in some sense the power to just sort of redefine reality, in some sense, where it all kind of breaks down. But this always existed, and I would say that this is the exact same cultural thing that happened in Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany. And they had the only technology that they had, which was a new technology, was the radio. So yeah, I mean, because this has culturally happened so much before, I would say without the technology, I think to blame it on the technology is just wholly, it's a stupid idea. Um, Also, I think the timing is the conflation here is completely off. I mean, the generation that we're complaining about, I don't know if they played, you know, if they were really that vortexed by technology. Um, and the people in the 90s that grew up in the 90s, I think, also had a lot of video games and things like that, and they didn't actually. Anyway, I sometimes get confused about how to define generations by letter, but these people who are 25 years old, um, I mean, if anything, their minds have been molded by the kinds of teachers that they've had, which have all been very, in some sense, I think that it's been Generation Y that has clung on to all this kind of radical feminist. Also, I mean, it seems to me that they made very bad parents, that they didn't look into, you know, wanting to avoid sort of traditional morality. They wouldn't read Aesop's fables to their children or something like that, and instead they wanted to find some book about something edgy or something like that. Sort of radical left wing infused strange things about systemic oppression, where the narrative is so superficial. Um, the themes themselves are because well, the one thing uh, that I agree on is that the ideology itself does seem to be locked into this juvenile um, sort of the imagining of the self, which is fundamentally solipsistic or autistic. It's very insulated. But anyway, I did want to segue from this and start talking about collecting some of my thoughts around the model of the false ego complex, and specifically talk about some speculation around theories of self-actualization. So I mean, so now I'm not talking about Bret Weinstein and Jordan Peterson's conversation anymore. I'm just going to focus in on talking about my psychology theories. So I I have it's been very slow for me to make some progress on this, because I'm dealing with this from multiple angles on multiple fronts, and a lot of these things need to be tackled simultaneously. So it's a slow work of sort of intuiting all the sort of all the structure. So I think I've got some better definitions of each side of the mind to some degree, which I'm going to try to dig into that. So, I mean, I've used these labels secondhand, but to me they do mean something. But their definition needs to be filled out perhaps better. Whereas there is the superego, um, then the subconscious, then the unconscious, and then the ego. Those are the four sides of the mind. Now, the superego is fundamentally, at least at the start, half, at least, or most of it, 2/3 of it, is essentially not present. It's a floating parent function. Actually, that's half. Only half of it is not present. Okay, so it's a floating parent function with a trial and a sin, and that trial and the sin is arguably not even a trial and a sin because it doesn't know its own lust. So if the superego is somewhat, if the lust of the superego is fundamentally vacant, then can it really have a trial and a sin? Because what mark has it missed if it doesn't have a target, being the lust? So in some sense, it just has the knowledge of good and evil to donate to the subconscious, to be the subconscious's death and or its conditionality, the founding conditionality, the founding limitation and rule set that becomes the structure, the atrophy, the calcification out of which uh, uh, um, is layered the core of the individual persona, which is the subconscious. So in some sense, the subconscious is the first fully fledged side of the mind, and is the first sense of self, the dreamlike sense of self, the atmosphere, and it's very kind of naively narcissistic, in some sense, and usually it gets sick of itself, so much so that it impels itself to develop in unconscious valence. It moves from the subconscious into the unconscious. Now, I call it the unconscious, and the unconscious is a weird kind of word to call something. What I think I mean by that, and there's a weird kind of juxtaposition here, is that the unconscious, in my view, you're unconscious of it because it's what you actually experience as reality. So it's kind of like it exists on either side. It exists within the false ego complex. On either side is the subconscious, and what comes after it is the ego. And so it's sandwiched between the subconscious and the ego, and it's really contained in the middle of the false ego complex, to a large degree. And so it's this self-encapsulated interface that allows the subconscious to, in an indirect way, through through the unconscious experience, to delve into a broader expansion of in some sense those cognitive functions of psychological reality, which relate to the metatype section of the unconscious side of the mind, are um, yeah, I mean, those are real. It's like those are real objects, and so the reason why I call them unconscious is that almost psychologically, um, it has this kind of objective connotation that you're dealing in something that is external to you, something that takes on a life of its own, but you have to know it through some part of your consciousness. You so it's modeled to you out of the unconscious side of the mind, and so it's fundamentally also, I would say, something like it's fundamentally a deep mystery. Like it's a mystery without end in some sense, and this is going to be a confusing thing to say as well, but I think this is also why it generally corresponds. This is a weird thing to say because different people have different relations to this particular dimension. But the fourth dimension of psychological reality, moderation, the introverted sensing of what ought be, the sense of suggestion of what ought be, um, within your introverted sensing, that which is in the Christian archetype is, I would say, directly correlated with the water, um, which is one of the three witnesses spoken about in First John, First John chapter 5. And there are three that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three agree in one. Before that, it says, and there are three that bear witness in the earth: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And these three agree in one. Anyway, so that fourth dimension of the water, and it's interesting in Genesis, dividing the water from the waters from the waters. That there's a myriad kind of ways in which the objective sort of unconscious reality can be refracted and sort of anyway, it's a slightly poetical, but just to basically say that there are very different natures within different species of false ego complex, and it's interesting that maybe people that have at least a functional use of the fourth dimension of psychological reality might have a better ability of specifically reading qualitatively the different. I mean, I must say I've never been able to archetypally name things. I'm very good at breaking down. I can see something and I can deconstruct it and see exactly how it works very, very quickly. I can discern things, backwards and forwards. I can essentially read into things very, very, very deeply, but I can't very well name them, and that probably has to do with the fact that the fourth dimension of psychological reality in my false ego complex is part of, in some sense, it archetypally relates to the 3 days in the grave after my work of the crucifixion. I need to talk about this in a more elaborated way. Okay, let me just segue. I'm going to talk about a new topic. So, in my own experimentation on myself, to self-actualize, let's just say, and to try to integrate the superego with a reborn superego, or to integrate the superego and to remove the toxicity of the subconscious, because I do think that essentially the whole problem of the false ego complex is that the subconscious is conceived in some sense the implicit sin of the superego. So you have to rectify what's going on in the superego, and then you have to integrate the cleansed superego with the rest of the false ego complex to generate a new personality, essentially, which will be in the same space. This is speculative, but I still believe that essentially you can't alter your circuitry, and I'm starting to think as well that metatype is hardwired within the brain, that it might be that even on the chromosomal level that your brain stem will have a particular dimension of psychological reality that it sort of is tapping into, comporting itself into sort of corresponding and that will have, it'll be interesting to see if at some point it can be worked out if through through neurological, particular neurological chemistry, if there are ways in which you might be able to even see the different kinds of structures or neurochemically behaviors which correspond to different metatypes. But anyway, it might also be that if I'm roughly correct, then you are stuck the metatype that you are born, perhaps, or that you grow into, that you're generally stuck as that metatype. You might be able to change your metagram type within that metatype, potentially. That might also be hardwired in as well. Who knows? But anyway, so perhaps you can still use you can still lose your metagram type. Maybe the point is to revamp the unconscious circuitry, because I do think that it is the unconscious circuitry, which is generally what I describe in the metagram circuitry, which is particularly correspondent to sattva, rajas, or tamas. Or it might just mean that particular transcendence of the guna just has its own sort of particular style of self-knowledge that then, because if the circuitry never actually dissolves, but you just sort of gain a different interface with it and a different kind of, where you don't project it onto the external and therefore relate to it as a kind of unconscious external locus of control, because you can track all these things in terms of how you are judging it and how that is being manifested from your internal input, and therefore you have a deeper connection with the outward. That sounds like a weird kind of paradox, but in that the spiritual overlay that you have, the kind of the ability to co-create, the ability to sort of negotiate a shared reality in some sense, becomes so consciously enlivened that it sort of anyway, that's a kind of tangent. Okay, so the thing that I wanted to talk about was that the grave of the resurrection after the work of the crucifixion, or as part of the completion of the promise in the work of the crucifixion, but that the development of the new soul, or the new personality at least, I guess the novation of the soul from the false ego complex into a living soul, is that I can sort of see this in my own experience, that perhaps what happens is that the death of the superego, the lust of the superego, and the vanity of the superego are the 3 days in the grave, nights and days in the grave. And if that is true, that means that because I had gone on forever and ever and ever, that the New Jerusalem is the dominant function in the superego, and that might still be right, but that the New Jerusalem, at least my New Jerusalem, has not done that final work of completely the divine fire destroying the beast, which is given time and kept alive, and even continued to be given power before it makes its final war against the holy city, and then it gets taken out by fire from heaven. But what I think is needed is essentially to ground the false ego complex, is that the source of the toxicity is that the subconscious is broken, but it can't be fixed, because the person who broke the subconscious was the person that created the subconscious, which was the superego. And the superego never had a backstory. It was a floating parent function. It never had any integrity. Therefore, there was no integrity to be gotten from in anything, because it was the prime mover of the false ego complex. And in some sense, it's sort of like, how do you get the snake out of the garden when the walls of the garden are already everything is encapsulated? So you have to leave the garden, you have to go develop before you can sort of return to the garden with the antidote or something like that. But so the antidote really is that you have to wait in your grave for 3 days so that you can actually get a baseline of the external environment, so that you can set the superego straight. You can reboot it with with a truth attached to its sort of backstory. And so the and that's almost the point of the false ego complex, is that you have to develop your ego into such a state which is somewhat past the level of neophyte, after making it through the unconscious side of the mind and developing the ego yet further, on top of the unconscious side of the mind, uh, doing the work of the crucifixion. And then you have uh, then essentially you're like Neo in the Matrix, that gets to be taken on a cold slab of the metal crucifix, as these machines are taking him to negotiate in person with the machines in the machine city in the underground, um, and that lowly movement towards that negotiation, that very gritty and visceral, sort of real, threatening thing, where sort of it could all go badly or something like that, is the real sort of gritty reset point. And you have to, in some sense, you have to see how those three dimensions of psychological reality, those three cognitive functions that relate to the sin of the ego, which is also the death of the superego, those are the same dimension, and the the lust of the superego and the dominant function of the superego. You are there, dead, witnessing how those dimensions function, and in some sense, all those dimensions will, because how each dimension in a higher dimension is the core of the dimension of an earlier dimension, you're going deeper and deeper in. So the highest dimension there is the dominant function. So if you can just sort of understand how the dominant function works, then on a very particular level you have a general resolution or a general grounding for the superego. So the superego's dominant function is still, I think, the biggest sort of panacea in some level. But it's not a direct panacea. It's an indirect stabilizing framework and outline and groundwork. It gives you a general framework with which the parent function in the superego can be regrafted, perhaps, or can be rejuvenated. And it is kind of like the reality check of the parent function in the superego. And now, the parent function in the superego is just as twisted as the lust of the subconscious. And that's the competing new personality in some sense. And maybe that is actually the true sort of New Jerusalem there. But it's interesting that the framing groundwork for that is, so I would still say that the dominant function. But yeah, so anyway, I know I've said all of this, and I'm slightly contradicting myself, is that what I just said is maybe the kind of thinking that you have to go through in order to directly tackle the parent function and just restart it and reboot it. That you have to kind of toy with the thing just outside of it that encapsulates it, because in some sense the parent function is yet one dimension higher. It is deeper. It is actually deeper to the problem. So confronting that problem head on is perhaps perhaps you have to lend yourself some collateral support from just trying to resolve it on the outline of it first, although that is quite obtuse. And I do think that if I can just sort of criticize myself, that there is I don't even know what they're called, but they used to have them. I think it was almost kind of like a pagan thing, where people used to have these giant medallions that would usually be made out of metal, and they would be incredibly intricately, forged and designed. And I think the point of that was to kind of almost be like when Ezekiel was talking about the wheels within wheels, that, is sort of like to have the mystery of life sort of in your back pocket, that you sort of proof that you're kind of a sophisticated soul, that you appreciate that your mentality is sort of grounded in that you have a token of this kind of being, sort of within the patchwork of some, sort of deeply esoteric structured sort of thing. But anyway, I do think that the dominant function, the superego, is kind of like that. And it can also, I think, the superego itself, I think, is also related to some other issues, which I just thought I'd kind of name drop a bit or whatever. But I do think that the daemon, in the kind of in the Greek, also sort of Platonic understanding of that the superego is the daemon, and I think that also the idea that our daemons do have different ground or different footing. They have a slightly different anatomy, in that, depending on which psychological or sphere of reality they correspond to, they have a kind of a different power. And in some sense, I think that they could also be a point that's related to that corresponds with sort of how some people like to get into these weird kind of esoteric systems of all these different angels and demons, but specifically, I would say that it could respond both. This could correspond both to angels and demons, and in the sense that you could have the superego that is in some sense unwieldy and is not moving towards its own sort of self-integration, and that is trying to cement its kind of self-satisfied fragmentation or something like that. And I do think that there are ways in which people can have a kind of spiritual avatar that can represent states of the superego, which in some sense, can be how people get weird vibes from each other that, to do with what your superego is sort of entrenched in and what somebody else's superego is kind of entrenched in, uh, or and how that might be sort of sort of at odds. Um, and so I had a point that kind of talks about this, where it goes on to talk about how, Carl Jung, uh, uh, he had a very strange and weird, but also interesting link with a tulpa, which in some sense I think tulpas, which are seen to have independent spiritual identities to some degree, but which can be sort of created uh, um, through an act of consciousness and have a life of its own, as if it is its own sort of independent ideal form, that it almost a kind of an act of spiritual procreation, but that after it's created, it's just as ontologically viable as any other member of the kinds of souls that inhabit things. But anyway, the Carl Jung had a very strange relationship with his tulpa. But anyway, actually, there's no point in going into that discussion. But uh, I guess I'll just say weirdly, I think I have memories from that tulpa of but I mean, I also have sort of shared dreams, I think, that I've had with Carl Jung. But I mean, anyway, uh, even the rituals that he went through. Um, I remember when I was a very, very, very young child having shared experiences as being witness to those rituals that he, I would even call them play rituals, that while I was playing, he was playing in his attic with figurines. Um, anyway, I know that this is actually a reported story of in some sense how he used to have these deep spiritual experiences, and sort of he would sort of commune. And anyway, I mean, I remember having lots of shared experiences between a particular age age range or whatever. But it was weird because that also precipitated me speaking to people in the Jungian community, and even speaking to some people who uh, anyway, this is not really important. But I just find it interesting because I think that there are, anyway, I mean, I don't think that the timeline affects any of these sorts of things. That when I say that, I mean, I think that there are spiritual experiences and shared awarenesses which are um, essentially the spiritual plane is superior to something like the scientific conception of the linear timeline. But anyway, I guess just put that all to one aside, since it didn't really talk any more about the superego. But I do think that it's weird because the superego itself, I mean, I guess, if you were to relate the superego to the brainstem, or at least the parent function in the superego to the brainstem, something like that, that there's a physiological component that gets attuned to something, then you can almost imagine that there would be something like uh, an ability of this, in some sense, most ephemeral core of the project of developing a schema, or a psychological um, structure, that would, if it was capable of knowing itself, or if it was capable of having somewhere some recourse to a model of the kind of structure that it itself is predicated on, that it would be involved in being able to name itself and characterize itself, and sort of pick up on different characteristics of even contributors, or let's say movers, or that are all agents in the same realm, that even within other brain stems that are tuned into the same dimension of cognitive reality, that there, I guess, let me just import one thing from philosophy, the concept of ideal forms. And if you allow that, it's not that far away to say, I mean, if you just philosophically believe that there are such a thing as ideal forms, then essentially the eternal characteristic of the character of agency that will be animating this particular brainstem, or something like that. I mean, essentially, you can probably, uh, on some level, I mean, I guess, you don't. This isn't a proof for eternal life, or for the eternal nature of the soul, but in some sense, I mean, because I guess you could always just say, well, even if these metaphysical things are permanent categories which then have physical correlates, it could just be that the physical manifestation is just a kind of a possibility that gets stochastically animated, or something like that. But anyway, okay, well, I'm describing this very badly, and I'm not really making an argument. I'm just trying to discuss the point, that in the same way that tulpas might be conjured, um, that they are not created. Uh, they are merely, in some sense, uncovered, or discovered, or from the one, from the good. Uh, if you sort of believe in at least sort of the Greek Platonic divided line, sort of metaphysical substrate. But anyway, so Anyway, so if the superego is something like the root of the soul, and then already quite soon it sort of involutes itself in the construction of a subconscious, um, which is founded on orientating itself towards this toxic lust, the knowledge of good, um, which the soul is trying to sort of feed to the subconscious. Uh, which it will have to give an account for at some point, or at least to clean up the toxicity, that'll have to be sort of reverse engineered. But that's only possible when essentially knowing the full backstory of the superego. Um, and I mean knowing the backstory in the sense of knowing the metaphysical context in terms of witnessing, silently witnessing through the work of the crucifixion and being dead in the grave for 3 days is, I guess what I'm saying is sort of to be awake to the death in the grave. Is that the waiting in the grave, but not yeah. So in some sense, I see that the ego is giving its is actually has created enough awareness in its inferior function that the inferior function is capable of withstanding the sin of the ego. And the inferior function in the ego is capable of passing the baton all the way to the parent function in the superego. So that you kind of get this jump from the inferior function in the ego to the parent function in the superego. So yeah, that maybe I was just sort of wasting my time going on and on and on about being dead in the grave. And that was kind of like a diversion, but maybe that diversion was the actual act of being, is witnessing the death of that. In some sense, it's a bit tough with a spiritual metaphor, but yeah, being dead for those 3 days and nights means that you actually have to kind of perceive your absence of operation on those dimensions of psychological reality. And when you perceive the absence of your operation on those dimensions, so that you can just kind of get a baseline of how those dimensions function with you taken out of the picture, because in some sense your inferior function is not engaging with the sin, or rather it's not engaging with the death of the superego, because it's kind of already taken the crucifixion for the sin. It's endorsing the crucifixion for the sin. So because the sin is being accepted and not reacted to, you get to witness the superego, what would usually just be this kind of void and abyss gets light shone onto it. And maybe letting all those things out of the abyss was actually not even necessary, but maybe it's unavoidable, perhaps, in order to really see the non-operation of those things is that you still had an inadvertent sort of magnetic circuitry going through it, and so things were happening there, but it was completely in the dark, in the abyss. And so when you shine a light on it, you see that there are things that are happening because of you, but not because of any kind of active movement or indication, only from things outside of those dimensions. So I guess you can sort of see how those dimensions have been maybe disfigured to some degree or something, but anyway, all these sorts of metaphors might not even be worth delving into. Somehow just need to integrate the inferior function with the parent function, or get the parent function to independently be reborn. Anyway, that's something that I need to focus on myself, I guess, is seeing about the independence of that parent function in the superego. But so just some other general things here is that I do think that essentially it is it's generally also so the superego and the subconscious, in terms of how they connect together, that is the primordial tension which is getting sort of diffused into the unconscious side of the mind. So the unconscious side of the mind already, in some sense, I think that in order to get the ego into a good enough state that it's capable of crucifying itself, the unconscious side of the mind would need to sort of try to be independent of the subconscious, try to turn its back on it, and try to sort of perfect the ego of the unconscious side of the mind, independent of its death and lust. So there's a tension between the child function and the unconscious, the lust and the dominant function. And even when it does that, it will have to then contend with the toxicity that comes from the unconscious as parent function, to try to win it over into this new order. And the extent to which that it's capable of succeeding in that, the ego will be able to kind of leverage some kind of independence and fortitude, and sort of, that will agglomerate into the inferior function, and let's say the integration of the inferior function into responsibly taking accountability for the sin of the ego, which becomes sort of self-directed in some sense. And that is the general solution to the false ego complex. But it doesn't feel good, and it will only start to feel good once you can actually get an eye on the superego. And when you see the superego, and then you see the false prophet in the parent function of the superego, and you cleanse the false prophet, anyway, but that's the latter half. Or going after that, once the superego is trying to integrate itself with the subconscious, all you're trying to do essentially is to defang the toxicity from the superego and the subconscious. And the unconscious and the ego already kind of work as almost a static, solid state. I'm just trying to think if that will... So all those kinds of mechanics, or in spite of the toxicity of the subconscious and the superego. The subconscious and the superego is just where you actually get the liberation from. Because, I mean, I can even do this, although I haven't focused on doing it. But essentially, if you just concentrate, which is what I can do, on the subconscious lust, you can just negate it. You can literally obviate it. So you can just say, well, I know that I'm trying to do this, I'm trying to acquire this, or I'm trying to attain to something. How about I just already grant myself the status? I already grant myself the effect of that. And you can just kind of award it to yourself. And so, because, but the problem is that doesn't work as a long... I mean, maybe it does work if you constantly work at it, I'm not sure. But the problem that I see with that is that that isn't the problem. That was the cause of the old problem. But the actual problem is the habitual thinking that is indirectly connected with the lust. It's not... The lust itself is not the problem, it's the dominant function is the problem. It's the vanity of the subconscious that is the problem. And you need essentially to develop a new dominant function. And so maybe that dominant function in the subconscious, that maybe that is the New Jerusalem. Maybe all the things I was saying about the dominant function in the superego was not even a thing. That was just part of the expunging of the kind of the surrounding contextual toxicity. So if it was the dominant function, then that would be, is it dimension 8 for me? No, it's dimension 9. Anyway, so yeah, I just want to segue into a completely tangential topic to this, which is that for me, the dominant function of the subconscious and the dominant function of the unconscious, I always make a circle that connects them. And then the parent function of the unconscious and the parent function of the ego, I make a triangle that where the base of the triangle is at the bottom is the parent function in the subconscious, and the pinnacle of the triangle is the parent function in the ego. And the parent function in the ego, I do think, is archetypally similar to, essentially, is the Whore of Babylon, or is the woman riding on the back of the Scarlet Dragon. So now I link those two parent functions together, and I don't know if I really have such a strong basis for that. In every species of metagram circuitry, I don't know if that is an across the board archetypal structure. But those two parent functions, I do think, in some sense, combine together to be the kind of the archetypal feminine, and the two dominant functions that I already described, I think those are the archetypal masculine. And we have kind of specialized within gender roles, and who knows, there might also be brain correlates to these things as well, loosely at least. But and you can sort of see this also within identity politics, particularly that the kind of toxicity that both men and women have within the identitarian movement, that what I call cerebral histrionics, they are being more masculine in some sense, but they are corresponding to a feminine ideological structure, and they are both sort of two pieces in this ideological structure. And the the triangle and the circle. Anyway, and I think that generally also that people do this so that they within stable gendered pair bonding, that the whole point of this is that essentially the two people are sharing the same psychological in some sense it's a kind of engaged they are sharing the same mental space. And it's interesting because, I mean, you can almost see this in many patterns within gender, that the difference in teaching style between men and women, and they can often reinforce each other quite nicely, in some sense, that women can often induce men, or induce anyone in some sense, using this to think about things. That by not, in some sense, by not instructing directly, but by inducing subtextually, in some sense. And it's interesting that well, the circle is below the triangle, and those deeper things are always above. So the triangle is always below the circle here, but in some sense, ontologically, the more basic thing is provided by, if you take this division as being representative archetypally of the circle being masculine and the triangle being feminine here. I mean, these shapes, I'm just referring to them, these probably aren't the best archetypal shapes to symbolize these things, but anyway, the reason why I chose these particular shapes is because the two dominant functions in a circle I guess there's not such a great justification for it, except that the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind I mean, you see, I don't know how to describe this at all, because I don't know what kind of state of what kind of individual I should be talking about, because people have different kinds of pathologies. So I guess, I mean, I could talk about the most pathological version of this, or I mean, the cerebral histrionic, or someone who is more integrated in a healthy way. But basically, it's very tough, because you have to get the unconscious to turn its back on the subconscious, but the subconscious is the source of psychodynamic generative energy. Without the subconscious, there is no unconscious. And the only way that that circle is maintained is by the parent function in the subconscious has to essentially allow that circle to virtually exist within the parent function. So in some sense, to have a healthy masculine circle there, it is all about how the maintenance that is being provided by the parent function in the subconscious, which is allowing the unconscious to get the keys to the car, so it can properly grow up, essentially, and not have to deal with the toxic subconscious dominant function. But the source of its power is the subconscious dominant function, essentially, is the engine that it can't be cut off from, but that it needs functional independence from, which is, in some sense, only provided by the subconscious parent function. So, and then the triangle is almost the opposite, is all about the dominant function in the ego, is sort of like the conduit, which becomes like the pet scarlet dragon. The whore of Babylon is essentially riding on a dragon that has become its pet. But it gets to be called a dragon. This is kind of, it's interesting, the parallel between that and the, and the pet male feminists, that kind of get sort of get celebrated publicly as they are, and as being so powerful and virtuous, and how sort of decrepit and sort of vacuous and internally messed up they are in some sense, but how they are sort of, they all have their unique majesty or some bullshit. Um, that they're all sort of magical beings or something like that. And as strangely sexually frustrated as they are, as they sort of have to fit into this, well, the parent functions already are very strange, because the parent functions exist to manage dominant functions. They exist as sort of as satellites, as constellating satellites, and without somebody else providing that dominant function sort of role, there's nothing for the parent function to do. The parent function has to correlate to something. It has to constellate itself around somebody else's dominant function if you're not going to be fully integrated within yourself. And so when women take on this particular role, in some sense, they are inducing people around them to take a more to embody their dominant functions more, so that they can have the material upon which to respond to, or which to corral, so they need, in some sense, a context that is already supplied by other people, because they're not willing to sort of risk it, and also in some sense, so I mean, there is a kind of perverse incentive for a woman to become more feminized in order to only use their parent function, because essentially the parent function is always additive. In some sense, it can always rebrand itself that, well, they were just adding to something that was already functioning, already happening, so that they never accrue any real agency, and therefore never any blame for any consequences. They can always be part of whatever did happen if there were good consequences. So somehow they share in the spoils, but they don't get a share of the penalty, if there is one. Is the kind of thing of the, that if the person riding the Scarlet Dragon doesn't get to, because the Scarlet Dragon wasn't strong enough or something like that, it's the Scarlet Dragon's fault. It's not the person riding the Scarlet Dragon's fault. So it's that kind of, it's really precarious right there at the apex of that triangle. But and in some sense, the parent function in the unconscious side of the mind is kind of like the alarm siren that is sounding its displeasure, because the whore of Babylon riding atop the Scarlet Dragon is not well situated as the apex of sort of power and dominance, because the subjugation of that parent function over that dominant function in the ego only works if their reality tunnel, if their ego conscientiousness, if their particular slant and moral version, if only their particular so basically the ego, for those things to come together nicely in a stable way or whatever, the ego has to be entrenched. And the only way for the ego to sort of be securely in place is if everyone is essentially said to share a part of the same objective paradigm. So in some sense, like, well, that triangle in some sense is very symbolic of dysfunction, where the parent function in the unconscious is just seen as just a reflective mirror of the deeper parent function in the ego, which already means that there's this built-in autism, there's a kind of built-in solipsism, there's a built-in sort of relativism that's deeply pathological and surreal, and it has no ability to reality test anything. Now I've contrasted this badly, because when I was talking about the dominant functions that are archetypally masculine, I didn't describe the pathological version. I just described the non-pathological version of how the parent function would actually operate properly. And then talking about this triangle, in some sense, this triangle, I think, is almost, well, is always toxic, even when you are doing your best. And so in some sense, the only way to actually, I would even say that this triangle is toxic, right? But you do actually have to develop it yourself. This is a necessary stage of development. This is kind of like maybe in the from the age of 17 onwards, from the age of between 17 and 28, maybe even as late as that. Maybe some people never actually mature past this stage, but some people are working towards it. I mean, you can see when some people seem to have blocked themselves off from ever being able to clear this hurdle. But essentially, is that this triangle is toxic as fuck, but it's in some sense everyone does it. It's kind of like cognitive dissonance and magical thinking. Like everyone has a little bit of, bias baked into them. And then you get the ones, people that are actually capable of being aware of their own sort of slanting, their own sort of convenient confabulation of things. And when people are sensitive to that, but not sensitive to it in a jaded and cynical way in which they are sensitive to the fact that they are aware of it but they don't care, or they're, when I say that they're sensitive to it, as in like they're responsive into actually trying to tackle it, or to graduate from it, that means that they are developing data and information about this triangle so that they can see what is above the triangle, and what is above the triangle is the inferior function above the parent function. And that inferior function, in some sense, if that becomes the seat of consciousness to some degree, if that becomes the central characteristic of the sense of self, then you are already in gear to sort of really be cognizant of your own footprint, and in some sense that gives you a solid internal locus of control where you can really self-master. There's a lot of self-mastery, I would say, that just comes from being aware of that dimension of psychological reality, of that cognitive function that corresponds to the inferior function above that triangle. So if that is the thing, then what should I say? And in some sense, like, that is what traditionally all women have. That has been the virtue of woman, that has been sung out and celebrated as the mature, integrated feminine. But it is also not just only women that need to integrate their inferior function with their ego. Men also need to do that, but I do think that there is something of that particular form of maturity, which is in some sense a deeper form of maturity. I mean, you have to get both mechanisms functioning, and I don't know. I think it might be possible to get the one mechanism to function while the other mechanism doesn't function, but in some sense, you need both to function. In some sense, if one isn't functioning and one is, you probably are capable of doing more damage or being more strange. But anyway, yeah, so I think those are the two great developmental challenges that I've just kind of described. The one is essentially the parent function in the subconscious, which is the gatekeeper between having, let's say, a healthily reborn unconscious side of the mind, or at least a firewall between the toxicity of the subconscious and an unconscious that is capable of operating its dominant function, turning its back on the subconscious dominant function. which is needed. I do think that dominant function, the unconscious, needs to face away from the dominant function in the subconscious. Like, I'm trying to be careful with this metaphor, because face away doesn't mean that it should necessarily bully where it comes from or something like that. That it shouldn't try to be the opposite. It shouldn't just merely sort of try to negate it. It has to negate it in a very sort of clever way of leaving it behind, not just merely trying to sort of do the opposite in inverted commas, because that ends you up sort of being in an obsessive fixated sense as well, being enslaved by it just merely by anyway trying to fix your gaze on something in order to do the opposite of something is another way of just, because you'll end up anyway. And so, yeah, if anything, I think the parent function does need to be mostly a part of that. The parent function of the subconscious needs to regulate that. So it's more about fighting over the parent function and fighting the parent function in the subconscious onto the side, and then monitoring the parent function. That's what you need to monitor, is monitor the parent function. As being the source of the firewall in some sense, and maintaining the correct logistics over that. Anyway, and then the second thing is essentially the development of the inferior function in the ego. Which in some sense is an answer and is a correspondent, in some sense it needs to take accountability and responsibility against the bad things done by the parent function in the ego. In some sense it needs to be militarized against the parent function in the ego, and the parent function in the ego needs to be understood as feeding this false alarm to the parent function in the unconscious. And if the inferior function can know that about itself, can know that about the ego, can know that about the structure of the ego, then you've got essentially a roadmap for the inferior function being a proper control center that is capable of sort of managing all these complicated things. Now, as the inferior function is doing that in the ego, I do think it's possible to even be able to have that level of maturity and do that on some scale, but in some sense it's kind of watered down, because you're not actually doing the work between your unconscious and your subconscious between what I would roughly count as Keegan stage 3 and Keegan stage 2. Is that if your Keegan stage 3 is sufficiently polluted by Keegan stage 2, if your subconscious dominant function is still holding the keys to the car and doesn't let the unconscious actually develop its own encapsulated, independent, objective realm or something like that, then when the ego is doing its sort of thing and taking responsibility for things, what it's taking responsibility for didn't even have an independent comportment of integrity, because you're part of the narrative, which is still being gerrymandered by the subconscious dominant function, because the subconscious is very immature. The subconscious is like trying to argue with a 3-year-old that is being bratty. That has sort of learned a precocious trick that if you can pretend not to understand something, then you can indulge in your feelings, and you can use your feelings as a bulwark to get your way or something like that. Anyway, I'm not. But essentially, the subconscious is fundamentally, naively narcissistic because it doesn't actually believe in other. Doesn't believe in anything other than the superego. The subconscious is a creature that was created by the superego. It was created out of the superego, repurposing parts of the superego. And in some sense, all of its humanity is only laden in that parent function. So the nature of the subconscious is, in some sense, the whatever nature has been indelled into it by that superego parent function. The serpent that makes a particular form of knowledge of good and evil and a particular form of contract in some sense. Um, I'm going to have to clean this up a little bit. So yeah, I did now just want to talk about in general some general categories of philosophy and talking about the different parts of the mind, um, and how I see these things fitting together in self-actualization and stuff like that. So the subconscious, okay, so I do think that perhaps even that the brain itself might even be in the image of the metatype structure. Uh, and that um, the only sort of variation is that, like, what is the starting block in some sense, and then because of neurochemicals having some corresponding metaphysical sort of reflection of the metaphysical, or in combination with physiological brain structure, might essentially create a kind of a cascading, reliable, sort of domino effect of how, well, once that is established, then the rest of the brain comports to that model, and to that procession of interconnectedness of how, sort of in the rubric of, anyway, and so the part of the brain, if I could say it like that I mean, and I'm not really interested in the physiology myself, but I'm just saying that I think that there probably are huge correlates that probably could be made. But anyway, at least within the earlier structures, I mean, it might be that the unconscious itself might be a bit of a cross wiring of some of the other stuff that, in some sense, maybe the superego, of which is mainly just the parent function, and then there's the subconscious, and then there's the ego, and then the unconscious is just kind of like the cross-purpose communication that sort of, as a interwoven, a countervailing, mishmash of interference, or not so much necessarily destructive interference, but sort of creative cross-wiring or something like that. But anyway, and then that creative cross-wiring is something perhaps that will either have a particular representation in particular sets of neurochemical levels, and aggregating it up almost statistically, but that there might be, particular structures which are unique, even perhaps to certain metagram circuitries within certain metatype structure. But anyway, which would be interesting, because then essentially you would be able to get to the point at which that you could confirm diagnoses, or with some kind of neurological scan or something like that, or potentially, or with sampling, some level of something that you could, if you knew something, that then you could get to the point where you could psychometrically test someone, and then you could confirm the test physiologically. Anyway, that's if all these sorts of things hold. But anyway, that's not really that important. But and I've already said that people know something about all the emotional tones and field circuits. They have some awareness, I would say, of them, although they can only relate. People can only relate to circuitry that they don't have contained within them by analogy with the circuitry that is contained within them. And in some sense, their circuitry is their antennae, is their sensitivity in the field matrix, in the field matrices. And if you exist, if your circuitry is involved in certain field circuits, and you have other circuitry which you can see is happening around you in much a similar style in some sense, but that you know that it's operating in a field circuit that you have no sensitivity to, yeah. So anyway, it just makes me think that how I've already explored anxiousness and bashfulness and spoken a lot about it. It makes me think that it really might be worth it, philosophically or sociologically, going through all the field circuits and trying to elaborate them out into more sort of mythological forces and things like that, and just see the different realms and the different sort of dynamics that seem to comport to those issues, or whatever. And I do think that would probably have a high correspondence with some religious writing already, more so Hinduism. But anyway, and Buddhism as well. I mean, I actually take the names, the 24 emotional tones that I use are actually or labels that I took from Buddhism, because Buddhism canonically came up with there are 25 emotions, and they named them. And they said these are the true distinct emotions that people have. And I used 24 of those 25 because the only one that I left out was happy. So I took the 24, and because I knew that I was looking for a number of 24. Anyway, and then I literally apportioned the structural definitions. I best fit them, and I think that I actually did a good job, but that's for other people to confirm, I guess. But anyway, Anyway, so the subconscious. Yeah, so I mean, I'm quite hard on my subconscious, I guess, or I mean, I've described all these things that sort of leave it out in the dark and it's naively narcissistic. And now I've just been talking about, my own self-actualization and sort of fixing the parent function in the superego. But, how to actually deal with the subconscious that I have vilified for so much. And in some sense, it's all to do with the lust in the subconscious. That becomes the last problem, is the lust in the subconscious, which, it's all well and good to blame the parent function in the ego as being the whore of Babylon. But, in some sense, the root of the problem is in the subconscious. And, it's not the subconscious's fault that the superego parent function was a false prophet to it. So, how do you rehabilitate that dominant function in the subconscious and lust in the subconscious? Those are the two. That's the crux of the. That becomes the final boss, the final beast to conquer. What can I do? Oh, I guess, yeah. And I need to do better at defining the ego as well. So I've talked about the unconscious, I've talked about the subconscious. And I do think that the Keegan stages are actually good descriptions of each of these sides of the mind. Maybe with the exception of Keegan stage 1, because my view of the superego is just way more esoteric and strange. But Keegan stage 2, I think, is like, or the subconscious, and Keegan stage 3 is like the unconscious, and Keegan stage 4 is like the ego. And then obviously I don't have a fifth side of the mind, and I would say that Keegan stage 5 can only be done through essentially the inferior function of Keegan stage 4 integrating with Keegan stage 1, essentially. So for me, it's Keegan stage 4 and Keegan stage 1 in a very sophisticated sort of integration that actually provides Keegan stage 5. And I deride Keegan talking about Keegan stage 5 because I think he's just talking about people who are winning some societal power game, and they think that they're sophisticated and that they have integrity, but they don't have integrity. They're just acting as a high status participant in a high trust society, and then they conflate trust with integrity, something like that. They're just they have a toxic holdover of their subconscious. They believe that they have right beliefs. They believe in a narrative. They have used a narrative from Keegan stage 2 to kind of underpin Keegan stage 3. And I would even say that these are people that are not even properly in Keegan stage 4. They are not even on the level of Keegan stage 4. They are in a kind of Keegan stage 3 that's puppeting Keegan stage 4, and has a kind of involuted inception into Keegan stage 2. They're playing out a way to be vindicated in their relativistic motivation, sort of using a Keegan stage 2, Keegan stage 3 high hybrid of sort of cosmological narrative or the unconstrained vision of as Thomas Sowell would describe it. It's that kind of open-ended sort of engagement in a Ponzi scheme where they have told themselves that there's no other efficient frontier to operate within, so they can leverage hard skepticism against anyone who doesn't see to them their superior default sort of gainsaying over integrity. So they've built integrity out of a negative sort of value of everyone else doing anything else, so they can sort of justify being close-minded and grounding their integrity in a kind of negative aspersion and projection. So in some sense, they actually become tethered to a negative evaluation of some other. That is how they ground their own value in their own system, is that because in some sense it's not living, it's not operative, it's their value is in the thought realm, it's in a kind of hypothetical, and they can only indulge in that hypothetical. So they're kind of using their ego to save Keegan stage 3. They want their parent function to endorse their unconscious side of the mind. They're just kind of two reflections of the same thing. Whereas in the static state that I describe, that static state is being solely driven by the inferior function in the ego. Where in some sense the inferior function is seemingly reacting to itself, and that is how it kind of comports an internal locus of control. I did want to add to this recording a kind of more sort of philosophical threads and moral issues and things like that. But anyway, I'm too tired now, but maybe I'll add to this recording